Today we're talking about DAC or DAC, digital to analog converters. Now I have reviewed many DACs on my channel, about 30 to 40 DACs, and if I include the ones that I have not reviewed on this channel but have freelanced for other magazines, as well as the ones that I owned before I started my review career, and the ones that I used to play around with at the high-end audio store that were ridiculously expensive prices, then we're nearing around 100 DACs or more. And I'm not including portable DACs or integrated DACs. I'm talking about standalone DACs just alone by itself. So in this video, I want to share with you what I have learned through comparing and listening to 100 different DACs and if it's worth your money to spend on upgrading DACs. So 3 things to clarify here. Number 1, this video is not a guide to find the right DAC. I already made a guide video, so you can go check that out before or after this video. This video is more about the upgrades that come with upgrading your DAC. Is there a difference? Is there a substantial enough difference to justify the cost? Is it worth the money put into your system towards the DAC? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Number 2, stating the obvious, this video is about my opinion of comparing 100 or more DACs during my journey up until this point. My opinion may change in the future depending on what I experience, or it may not align with your experiences, and that is totally fine. Just be respectful in the comment section when you disagree with me or whatnot. Totally fine. Just have a civil conversation. Number 3, this video is about what I heard, what you heard, and not about beliefs. And I want to make that distinction very clear because I hear so many times often in the comment section where someone says DACs should be transparent as it possibly can be, and if it colors the sound in any way or fashion, then it's a faulty DAC. Highly disagree with that comment, and not because I believe it, because once again, because I heard it. In fact, I'll share a little story with you right here during my journey. I used to believe, right up until about 3 years ago, I used to believe that DACs should have no sound characteristic of its own. Amplifiers, speakers, sure, but DACs up until that point in the chain should be neutral, transparent as possible, and all the alteration in the sound should be made in the amplifier or the speakers. That's what I used to believe. However, after trying out 100 different DACs or more, I have to say, if your goal is to satisfy your beliefs, then you can stop right there and buy the most neutral DAC, the most well-measuring DAC, like a topping or smsl DAC for under $1,000, and you are happy and you're satisfied with satisfying your own beliefs, and that is perfectly fine. However, from my experience of listening to 100 different DACs or more, I have to say that my belief was crushed because after hearing it, I can't deny for myself that I enjoy listening to DACs such as the AudioNote 0.1X or AudioNote DACs or tube DACs in general that has a natural tube coloration of its own, and that gives a more of a flavor to the sound in my system that I enjoy more. And you might be asking, well, why don't you just do that in the amplifier and speakers? And you can. But again, once again, hearing is believing. And when I hear different DACs of different style, different implementations, and so on, I can't deny for myself that I enjoy more tube character DACs like the AudioNote. That may again vary from your experience or your opinions. Now it's about to get pretty darn confusing, so pay attention very closely. Now the world of DACs is similar to amplifiers or speakers in that they do make a difference, but if a speaker makes this much of a difference, amplifiers, let's say, make this much of a difference, and DACs make like this much of a difference. So significantly less of a difference, at least from my journey and my experience of trying multiple DACs, than a speaker or an amplifier in your system. However, it is not that simple. If it was that simple, then I would just say spend more money on your speakers and your amplifiers and forget about the DAC. However, unfortunately, there is a truth to the audiophile saying, shit goes in, shit goes out. Meaning, you may have a great set of speakers, you may have a great set of amplifiers, and you may have a great streaming unit. However, if your DAC isn't on par, it could, and this is the key point here, it could be the bottleneck of your system that is preventing it to flourish in sound and sing. And again, this is from my experience of trying different DACs. I've heard in systems where a significant difference was found by just changing the DAC and nothing else in the system, not even speaker placement. Everything was kept exactly the same, only the DAC was changed and there was a significant difference in sound. And in this case, it's kind of hard to put a finger on it and say, well, DACs make this much of a difference compared to speakers making this much of a difference, because by changing the DAC, the entire system changed for the better in a much significant way, and I've had this experience multiple times throughout my journey. So while yes, DACs do make a smaller difference than amplifiers or speakers do, but at times if it is the bottleneck, then yes, it can make a significant difference by upgrading it to a better DAC. Now define better, and that's the thing. I'm not trying to scare anyone by saying, oh, your DAC may be the bottleneck. I don't know if it's the bottleneck. And often it has less to do with the price and more to do with the entire performance of the system and the synergy. There are times where you change your DAC and there's a significant difference in the system, while you change to another DAC and it may bring no difference whatsoever. So it's a tricky one, but as always with hi-fi, it is a trial and error thing. So often you want to demo DACs and you want to try multiple before you bring a conclusion to the table thinking that DACs make no difference after trying maybe only 2 or 3 DACs. So long story short is that you have to try it for yourself based on reviews out there or demoing it by yourself. And it is not an easy thing, and it is much easier to just give you a straight answer, either DACs make small difference or they make a big difference, and have a firm belief in that. But I'd rather give you the truth, and the truth is that it varies from system to system depending on what you have, and it really boils down to you trying in your system the right DAC fit for you. And of course, the inputs and outputs and all that has to align with how you use the DAC. So does it have optical, USB, I2S, and so on? Again, that will be found on the guide of my how to find the right DAC guide. So check that video out for that. But in this video, I want to talk about right now what we hear in the upgrades. What is the difference we hear? And when I say upgrades, sometimes it is a distinctive upgrade, meaning you hear things that you like more. For example, when I go from a denafrips Terminator Plus to my AudioNote 0.1x, I hear a difference. Now, the difference may be to someone like myself an upgrade, whereas to some other people, it may actually be a downgrade. And that is because it has different sound characteristics. The AudioNote 0.1x, for example, is a tube DAC, and so is the DAC 5, which is a much more expensive AudioNote DAC. And these differences are less fatiguing in the high frequency, it's less detailed, but the soundstage is more open, wide, and deeper in comparison to something like the Terminator Plus, which is a much more detailed oriented DAC that has lots of detail and lots of textures and nuances in the music that you hear. And that is very readily noticeable every time I change my DAC here. Every single time I have a system set up, I switch between different DACs to find the right DAC match for the system as I would for an amplifier or speaker matching. So at the end of the day, DACs can make a significant difference. Holo audio is another great example. I reviewed the KTE, the flagship hollow spring DAC. And that was a very different sound from the denafrips Terminator Plus, and I liked both of them, but for different reasons. The Terminator Plus, again, was a more detailed-oriented, more audiophile-like in the sense that you hear all the details and nuances and all the micro details and all that kind of stuff, but the holoaudio was more laid back. It was a more warmer sound, and it makes the entire system more warmer sounding. So, for example, if you have a warm speaker with a warm amplifier, then probably the holoaudio may be too much in that system, as it will warm everything up to almost dark levels. But again, if you put a denafrips in that system, then that may change for the better. So really, it's about synergy as well as the balancing act, right? You don't want everything in your system to be warm. You want to have a nice balance, whether it be the DAC or the amplifier or the speakers. You don't want everything to be warm or everything to be analytical unless that's the exact sound that you want in your system. So again, some DACs make a significant difference, like from the denafrips and the holoaudio to the audio note. These are the DACs that I found to have significant differences between each other when I have a system set up and have prolonged demos in my system. Now you may be watching my video up to this point and thinking, well, this guy is full of shit. I have tried 2, 3, 5, 10 different DACs and they make no difference in my system, let alone an upgraded sound. So how is this guy talking about upgraded sound and all this bullshit, right? So let me be very clear. I have had times where I heard no difference in DACs as well. It's not every single time I hear a significant difference in DACs. Oftentimes I'm describing small differences, and if it's small differences, I will say it's small differences. Second point is that sometimes I hear no difference, and that's probably why I made a video like this. Now, I'm not picking on every Chinese manufacturer. I'm not talking about denafrips or holoaudio. I'm mostly talking about SMSL, Topping, Gustard, and Loxi and all these other companies that are basically copying each other to an extent where multiple units that look exactly the same, just different colors and slightly different finishes with same remotes that work on every single unit, right? All the remotes are same, and when I hook it up, I can't deny that they sound so similar to a point where there's no point in describing the sound of these units because it's a side movement for most people. Now, some of you have commented in my video saying that, well, I do hear a difference with Topping, SMSL, Gustard, and all these other DACs. But what I want to know in the comment section is, how many times have you bought an upgrade, like, a little bit more expensive Topping DAC from your previous Topping DAC and actually heard a significant difference, significant upgrade? Because for me, it was more of a side movement every single time, little differences, too small to say it's an upgrade or a downgrade or a side grade. It was just way too similar to justify an upgrade in any way or form. So anyways, that is one scenario where I have to say, yes, there's small differences in DACs sometimes, especially if the topology, if the chip being used, if the implementation of the chip, if the power supply is all very similar. Remember, there are many factors to what makes a DAC sound different, and if the factors are totally aligned, same power supply, same clock, same everything, and then you come to a point where, yes, they do sound very, very similar to one another, to where you can't really justify an upgrade or actually hear a difference. Number 2, it is absolutely possible for you to hear no differences with any of the DACs, and that may be true. And I had scenarios like this, and that was usually due to the room. If your room has no room treatment, or you have to have the speakers right up against the wall, if your system is not optimized for you to hear the sound staging, the imaging, and all the other stuff that I talk about in my reviews, then again, as I have said always in my reviews, you're not gonna hear 100% of what I'm talking about. So same thing with DACs. If I'm describing a difference and the difference is in the sound staging and your speakers are placed right up against the wall, then your speakers are not able to create that sound staging enough to kind of get those differences. And I'm not saying that you can't enjoy music if you have that setup. I'm just saying maybe a DAC upgrade isn't worth it for you if you have your speakers right up against the wall, and I'm describing the sound of the sound staging of the DAC. For example, I love the sound staging on the AudioNote 0.1x or the DAC 5, but if I'm describing the soundstage, how wide and how deep it is, and I have my speakers out 3 foot or 2 foot out into the room, and I'm describing those differences, I'm hearing those differences, but if I push the speakers back physically closer to the wall, then my depth and width naturally collapses, not allowing me to hear those differences. So it's kind of like buying an expensive microphone and setting it up in a very weird way and expecting it to record perfectly what the guitar or the performer is doing. And that is kind of asking a lot, even if it's a very expensive microphone. It needs to be set up right for it to do its job. In this case, the microphone is the speakers. So again, if you don't have the speakers set up properly, then you can't expect the DAC to upgrade your soundstage automatically. It only applies when you have the speakers set up properly. Again, at least in my experience. And I'll give you another example to clarify even further. Let's say I have a DAC like the holoaudio, and I say the bass is wonderful. It sounds crazy good, it's very punchy and dynamic, and the DAC makes the bass tighter and more focused and nuanced. But if you have your speakers set up in a way where there is boomy bass, right, uncontrollably boomy bass in your room, a little bit of an exaggeration, but let's picture that. How are you supposed to hear those differences? It's impossible. It doesn't matter if you put a $100 DAC or a $10,000 or a $1 million DAC, that room will still sound boomy because your speakers are placed in such a way to not be able to handle those bass. So again, without optimal setup, it is impossible to hear the differences in DACs. So you really can't make a DAC fix things. It does not fix things, it makes things better when they're set up optimally, at least from my experience. So when you hear no difference with DACs, that may mean other things in your system that is not set up optimally, especially your speakers from my experience. So yes, which means that if a reviewer like myself says, yeah, the soundstage on the AudioNote is amazing, it means nothing to you if you have your speakers set up close to the wall and you can't move them further out. So better not buy that DAC. If I say the detail and the refinement and the micro details and nuance is great on this DAC, and you have a speaker that is warm sounding, that does not have much of a high frequency refinement, then the chances are you're not going to hear those differences as much as you would have liked. So again, it really depends on what speaker you have, what setup, what amplifier you have already, and that plays a large effect into what you're hearing in your DAC. I've heard difference in DACs in much less expensive systems. It is not about the money spent on the system as much as how well you have picked your amplifier and speakers and optimized it in your space in terms of setup for you to hear those differences in the DAC upgrade. I repeat, it is not about the price. I have heard differences in much more expensive systems and no differences in much expensive systems. It is about how well the system and your speakers are set up to be able to hear the benefits given by the DAC. However, on the other hand, I do have to admit that there are times where the speaker's sound signature, not the price, but the sound signature takes a role on how you hear a difference in a DAC. And let me explain what that means. So I have had speakers in here that are transparent and very good at micro details like the Platimon. Now, Platimon has this airy presentation that seems open and spacious and has lots of micro details and nuances. It's a very great sounding speaker. So when I hook up stuff like the denafrips Terminator Plus, like I said, it gets a little bit too much for me. It gets a little bit too detailed for me. But when I put the AudioNote, it kind of smooths things out slightly. So while it retains all those micro nuances, it's not overbearing to my ears. I can enjoy those micro details coming at me for longer periods of time. It's better for me to play poorer recordings as well. But also with these type of speakers like Vocal, Magical, or Wilson Audio, or some of these speakers that do have high frequency energy, that does contain a detail oriented sound that gives you a lot of detail, micro nuances, and so-called the high-end sound, yes, you do get to hear a lot more difference readily on the DACs than if you had speakers that were more warmer, richer sounding. And yes, while this may be an unpopular opinion, this is something that I found during my journey. When I have warmer sounding speakers in my room, I find that the difference in DACs are harder to discern, especially in the top frequency because it's already warm, right? And on the micro nuances because the speakers already don't do micro nuances. So it is a little bit hard to decipher the upgrade that you speak of because, again, in this case, the speaker may be a bottleneck in the case of what you want to hear out of the DAC. Again, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that warm speakers sound bad. In fact, I prefer warmer sounding speakers. It's just that if you're trying to hear the upgrade in sound with DACs, it is harder, at least for me, to hear those differences with an overly warm sounding speaker or in general a warmer toned speaker. Now that doesn't mean that you should just drop the whole DAC thing if you have a warm sounding speaker. Quite the contrary. Like I mentioned before, if you have a warm sounding DAC with a warm sounding speaker, then that may become too warm in the system. In fact, when I had a warm sounding speaker in here that I have that's coming off a review very soon, that speaker, I preferred it with the denafrips Terminator Plus instead of my Audio Note DAC. So as you can see, again, it's a balancing act and about synergy. And so while it's much easier for me to just say go buy that DAC or DACs don't matter, don't worry about them, just buy a simple one, the truth is that from my experience and my journey, DACs do make a significant difference sometimes. So that is pretty much it for this video, but this may have left a lot of you very confused and want simple answers. But understand that when you got into amplifiers and speakers, it wasn't as simple as well. DACs are just another component in your system, but also it is the start of your system. Again, shit goes in, shit comes out. So while it's important for you to have a good sounding DAC that performs well, it is also important to note what you already have in your system and will you hear those differences. Again, not about the price, but the sound signature of your speakers, your amplifiers, and your system in general as of now. And by upgrading your DAC, what are you trying to gain out of it? And that's the first question I ask if my Patreons or anyone that I know ask me, should I upgrade to this DAC, right? I go, why would you want to upgrade? What are you trying to gain more out of it? And the chances are, if you are looking for an upgrade in certain things that your system is not already doing and is not set up to do, important distinction there, set up to do, then the chances are you're not going to hear those differences the DAC upgrade brings to the table, and it will be a waste of money, at least from my experience. So that's it from me. This has been my experience with DACs thus far after trying several DACs. Now, if you want me to make the top 5 recommendation video of DACs that I have tried so far that I have loved, then please click the like button. If this video reaches, let's say 3,000 likes, then I will make the top 5 DAC recommendations based on what I have heard so far. So that's pretty much it from me, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Don't forget to subscribe for more journey videos like this, and I'll see you guys on the next one.